I'm Ann Wadsworth, editor of publications at the Athenaeum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a reading by one of today's preeminent Latina authors, Esmeralda Santiago. Her many fans have been waiting 5 years for the next chapter in her tumultuous life story, which began with When I Was a Puerto Rican and continued by Almost a Woman. With her latest book, The Turkish Lover, This Wait is Over. Esmeralda Santiago was born in San Juan and came to the United States when she was 13 years old, the eldest in a family that would eventually include 11 children. She attended New York City's Performing Arts High School, where she majored in drama and dance, and eventually entered Harvard with a full scholarship. Her writing career evolved from her work as a producer and writer of documentary and educational films, and her essays and opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and a variety of other journals. Almost a Woman, her second book of memoirs, was made into a Peabody Award-winning film for Masterpiece Theater. In The Turkish Lover, Esmeralda finally breaks out of a monumental struggle with her powerful mother, only to come under the thrall of an older, more worldly Turkish man. She then discovers that passion, too, can become a prison. So before I reveal too much, it is my great pleasure to introduce Esmeralda Santiago.
Thank you. Good evening, and go Red Sox. As many of you might have been up until midnight, so was I. And I'm just thrilled at the result. But we're here to discuss literature, not baseball. So I would like to tell you, I will read from the book, but first I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I do, and some of you may not be familiar with my other memoirs, and I'll bring you up to date because it's important to have a little background about this young woman who happens to be me, but I have to think of her in the third person when I'm talking about the book. My first memoir, When I Was Puerto Rican, is about my childhood on the island of Puerto Rico, a childhood that is just about impossible to have anymore because the island has changed so much since I was a little girl, and the circumstances, even people as poor as we were, today have television and probably a car, and we didn't even have electricity, so it was a very different kind of life, and so When I Was Puerto Rican is really about that childhood and my awakening to what my culture was and trying to fit into that culture at the same time as I had aspirations to be something else, which was somebody even more rural and less connected to modern life, which is the Jíbaro of Puerto Rico of that time. The book takes place in the 1950s and ends at around the time that I am 15 years old. I came here when I was 13, and it ends with me auditioning, a disastrous audition, I might add, to the High School for the Performing Arts, and the question of what happened to her, which I thought was answered in the 2-page epilogue I wrote When I Was Puerto Rican. I mean, I graduated from high school, I went to Harvard, I lived happily ever after. Well, no. Many readers were dissatisfied with that 1.5-page explanation of my life after the audition. And so Almost a Woman became my next memoir. And that one traces my life from the point just shortly after we arrived in the United States, through my years at Harvard, learning language, learning culture, trying to figure out this whole new environment and the new way of being now that I am in a new place, at the same time as my mother is telling me, no, you cannot change. You have to remain the same. Just because we came here doesn't mean that you're a different person. And my experiencing, in fact, that I was a different person, and that confusion. And that book ends with a big decision I have to make at the age just shortly after I turned 21. I met a man a year older than my mother. a Turkish man who had lived all over the world, who spoke several languages, who was very dashing and handsome and well-dressed and soft-spoken and treated me in a very special way, and who asked me to go with him to Florida. He was having a minor surgery at the time. I thought it was like he was going to die if I didn't go with him. And so I decided to go with him, but I didn't have the courage to ask my mother or to tell her that this is what I was doing, because my mother was very, very strict, and I was afraid if I even so much as mentioned that I was leaving home without benefit of marriage with a man a year older than her, she would lock me in the bathroom and not let me out. And so I didn't ask her. I just left a letter the day that I left, saying, "Dear Mommy, I am leaving with the man that I love," and hoping that she would understand those words, because I didn't know how else to explain it, and I didn't want to explain it. So I left with this man who had changed my name from Esmeralda to Chiquita, who told me that no one would ever love me the way he loved me, who said that if I did everything he told me, things would be okay. And so that is the beginning of my life with the Turkish Lover. Almost a Woman ends with my trying to make this decision: do I go with this man? And the Turkish Lover begins with my letter to my mother and leaving home with him, and almost immediately realizing that might not have been the smartest move. But by then I was not only committed to the decision I had made, but I was not willing to change my mind, because I am very stubborn. I am one of these people that if I make a decision, I am right until I decide I'm not, and it took me 8 years to make that decision. So I would like to read to you from shortly after we arrived in Florida, which he was going to have this operation in Fort Lauderdale. I am by this time the eldest of 11 children. My mother has a little, sort of like a little sweatshop in the house that she had managed after many, many years, scraped up enough money to buy a house in Brownsville, New York. And so I left home, and here I am in Fort Lauderdale, and I'm about to go see my lover, Ulvi, who is post-op. Never having had to find a taxi anywhere but in New York City, I set out the next day along the Sunrise Highway, expecting that at any moment a yellow checker cab would go by. For over half an hour, I was the only person walking along the road. Everyone else was in a car or pickup truck, and some drivers looked curiously in my direction, scanning the area for a reason I was on foot. A couple of men pulled over to offer me rides, and I waved them away with a thank you and a few steps in the opposite direction. Finally, a police cruiser stopped, and the officer asked if everything was okay. When I explained that I was waiting for a taxi, he told me that in Fort Lauderdale one had to call ahead, and pointed to a glass-walled phone booth a few yards away, where a thick, dog-eared directory dangled from a chain. He drove by a couple of times after I made my call, and each time waved at me as if he were making sure I was okay. But I was a dark-skinned Puerto Rican from the outer boroughs of New York City, and his attention was not welcome. I was certain that he, like the sales clerk the day before, was watching me so that I would not steal something. When the taxi finally came, not a yellow checker cab, but a plain white sedan with bold red letters on the doors, I was feeling as if I had done something wrong, when my only crime had been to be on foot on the Sunrise Highway. Unlike New York's loquacious cabbies, this driver was sullen, preoccupied, so I didn't try to make conversation, but watched the flat, low landscape speed by in a flutter of pink, green, and turquoise. Again, I was reminded of Puerto Rico, but these streets, unlike those of my childhood, were richer, the homes surrounded by neat hedges and thick, well-tended lawns. The streets were deserted, except for the occasional delivery man or bouffant-headed woman walking a dog. The hospital was set back from the road and looked new. Inside, the floors and walls were shiny, the halls patrolled by women in white habits. The nun at the reception desk directed me to one of the upper floors. The squeaky tiles, the gleaming walls, the flowing white nurses' uniforms gave an impression of cleanliness and virtue. Ulvi's room was the last door before a tall, narrow window that shed bright light on the long hallway. As I walked, it felt as if I were floating on a shaft of light toward the sun, and I had to squint as I came nearer his door. It took me a few seconds to focus my eyes once I entered his dim, cool room. To the right was Ulvi's high hospital bed, and Ulvi wrapped in white sheets, his mournful eyes staring at my mother, who sat on the only chair in the room, her hands clasped over her purse. "What are you doing here?" I screeched. "I came to bring you home." Mommy stood up. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bloated from lack of sleep or tears or both. She bristled with anger, and I was afraid she would lift her hand and slap me in front of my lover. "I'm not going back with you," I screamed. A nun appeared at the door, and Ulvi lifted his arms weakly from under the white sheets and made a gesture as if to shoo us out of the room. He was still drugged from the surgery, his features slack, which made him look older than 38. Even through the haze, he managed to slur, "You should have told her, Chiquita." The nun glowered at Mommy and me. We stood side by side now, facing Ulvi's bed, for the moment unable to face each other. "Mr. Dogan needs his rest," the nun scolded. "Please leave." She settled the sheets around him, and I walked out, followed by Mommy carrying a suitcase. I couldn't speak, couldn't cry, couldn't see where I was going, but yet managed to retrace my steps down the sunlit corridor. A nun passed us, and I felt dirty and sinful. Mommy's anger was like a weight that dragged on me, even as my own anger and humiliation propelled me forward. I felt dizzy and wished I could faint so that Mommy's worry over me would replace her rage, which was as solid and transparent as the hospital's gleaming glass doors. I kept seeing Ulvi's face, drawn and dark over the stark white sheets, the displeasure of on his drug-slackened lips, his gestures shooing us out of the room. The nun's long fingers had pulled the covers up round his shoulders and trapped his arms inside, while her translucent face scowled at Mommy and me. The nun in her virginal robes and Ulvi wrapped in white sheets stood in stark contrast to Mommy and me, both of us practically glowing with fury, disappointment, and humiliation. We climbed into a taxi that was, through some miracle, waiting at the curb, and I gave the driver the address. In silence, Mommy and I were driven to the Gateway Arms, each looking out a different window, our backs to one another, waiting for the privacy of a locked door. No sooner had we entered the apartment than I began to yell at Mommy. Didn't even give her time to settle her things or to look around. Didn't try to speak calmly, woman to woman. Didn't try to take the bull by the horns, as Ulvi had suggested. Or maybe that's what the phrase meant. I was a toreador and she was a bull, and I goaded her, made her angrier than she was by being disrespectful, offensive, and insolent. How could she do this to me, I began, to show up unannounced, to sit scowling in front of a man who had just undergone an operation? What made her think I would return with her? What would I be returning to? A crowded house in a ghetto? No privacy? No room to breathe? Mommy was stunned. Her face fixed into a frown, her eyes narrowed. She stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. I was out of control and felt it. I had never spoken to her this way. Since we arrived in the United States, I'd been so conscious of how hard she worked to make sure that I and my 10 sisters and brothers had what we needed, that I hadn't dared complain about how the move affected me. I now told her that silence had not meant acceptance, that every humiliation I'd suffered in the United States was her fault, that leaving Puerto Rico had been her idea, that we hadn't progressed much beyond who we were in Macun, that I would much rather have stayed with my father in that remote, primitive barrio than endure the daily degradations of being a Puerto Rican in New York City. I screamed that getting an education was not worth the price of losing myself in the process, that our lives had not improved as she had promised, but had gotten worse. How much resentment had I stored over the previous 8 years? Enough to wound Mommy so that she could not answer my tirade with anything more than a hurt look and trembling hands. When I took a breath, she opened her mouth, hesitated, then yelled back, "Malagradecida! After all I've sacrificed for you, this is how you repay me." Ungrateful? What do I have to be grateful for? I screeched. I have nothing. I am nothing. I'm lucky a man like Ulvi is interested in me. Just look around here, I said. Look at where I am. A huge apartment with a swimming pool in front. This is better than anything you ever gave me. Just look. Have we ever lived anywhere like this? Mommy did stop to look around the roomy apartment, at the picture window leading to the narrow balcony, at the shiny new kitchen with dishwasher and garbage disposal. For this, her voice was tight, you gave yourself to him? I couldn't answer, didn't know if what she said was true or not. I love him, I finally whimpered. He's taking advantage of you. I responded that if so, it was fine with me. What else had I to give him but myself? The hurt look returned to her face, but she wasn't about to be silenced by me. What kind of man will take you from your family and not marry you, she asked, and I answered that marriage hadn't seemed so important for her with the 3 men she'd lived with. She slapped me and I fell on my buttocks and covered my head with my hands. She stood over me. Don't you ever speak to me like that. I don't care how old you are. Even when you're a grandmother, you are not to talk to me like that. Now pack your things and let's go. I'm not leaving. You can't make me, I yelled. I'll kill myself. I ran to the kitchen and pulled out a knife, a small knife with a serrated edge, but a knife nevertheless. Had I tried to cut my wrists, as I threatened to do, I would have merely scratched the skin. But Mommy fought me for it as if it were a machete and took it from my hands. You would kill yourself over him? She asked with a mixture of wonder and disdain. The minute she spoke those words, I stopped fighting. I leaned against the wall, my hands over my face. I had not only disappointed Mommy by choosing Ulvi over her, I was choosing him above life. In that instant, I knew that was the greater shame. Go away, I screeched, go away! Mommy picked up her bag and purse, opened the door and slammed it behind her. My heart grew so large that it threatened to explode through my chest. I sobbed with my whole body, had to sit on the floor and hold myself so that I would not break into pieces. Crumpled in the shag rug, I felt how completely alone I was now that Mommy had left. Had Ulvi walked in that instant, his presence would not have compensated for her absence. Had she walked in the door, the world would not have felt as big and frightening. I sat on the floor for what seemed like a long time, crying until my eyes were so swollen I couldn't see. There was a knock, followed by Mommy's voice, soft and not angry. Negi, por favor, ábreme la puerta. I stood at the door, hands on the knob, uncertain whether I should open it. I'm not going back, I said, and even as I did, I hoped she'd make me. It's all right, she said. You don't have to go back. I understand. I opened the door and fell into her arms and shed tears I didn't think were left in me. She led me to the sofa, both of us weeping. I wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how, which saddened me even more. There was no way to take back what I'd said, no way to return home after what I had said. My invective had changed both of us, had distanced me from Mommy more than I ever expected. Until that afternoon, there had always been a layer of respect between us, mutual, silent admiration for what the other achieved against terrible odds. But my words had torn through that layer, had diminished her achievements. I hadn't chosen Ulvi over Mommy. I had rejected her. He just happened to be there when I did. She understood the difference much sooner than I did. It would be years before I realized that by not fighting me anymore, she was seeing something I was blind to. Ulvi was not the reason I had left my family. I'd been leaving for a long time. He just provided the opportunity. Mommy helped me lie down on the sofa and went to the kitchen. Cabinet doors opened and shut. The refrigerator door hissed. Pots clanged against the counter. Water ran. Within minutes, she was cooking something that, even through my clogged nose, I recognized as the fragrance of love. So that's how she, that's what happened. I never knew how she found me, and I never asked her. And I never wanted to ask her because I didn't want to revisit that scene, that time. I just did not want to go there. But I was in Puerto Rico the beginning of September, and my parents usually come to my readings there. And I always introduce them because people are very interested in meeting them and knowing who they are. And so I introduced her, and she does her thing. She waves like the Queen of England. and everyone, was very appreciative. And then somebody raised her hand and said, "How did you find her?" And I just, I remember she was sitting like right there, and I just went like this. This is like I had never asked her. And she looked at me, and she almost, she just asked permission with her gaze. And so I said, "Go ahead, tell them, because I'm curious to know how you found me." So she said, "Well," she says, "I just knew that I would have to find you, because there was no way you were going to get away with just a letter." And so she said she went to my college. I was taking courses at Manhattan Community College, and so she went to Manhattan Community College and stood in front of the college asking everyone who went by if they knew who I was. And several people said yes, and then she kept through these people until she came to somebody who knew me really well, my Israeli friend. And my Israeli friend told her Ulvi's name, and that he lived on East 58th Street. She said, just between 3rd and 2nd, on that street. I know that that's where she goes all the time. So my mother goes to East 58th Street between 3rd and 2nd and stops at every building and asks if there is such a person as Ulvi Dogan, and finally comes to the building where he lives. And the doorman says, "Well, he does live here, but he's not here right now. He's gone to Florida." Bingo! So she realized that that's who he was. And so she asked the guy, "Where in Florida?" He says, "I don't know. I just know they went to Florida." So she went back home and called every hospital in Florida, because my friend had told her that, this man was having an operation, until she found him at this hospital, and then got on the next plane and sat in his room because she figured eventually I would show up. And that's what happened. She said she went there with every intention to beat him up. But when she saw him lying in bed, and he was really had just come out of surgery, and he was just lying in bed looking so pathetic, she felt so sorry for him that she decided not to beat him up just then. And then I walked in, and then we had this big, and she calls this a discusión. She says, and then we went to her apartment and we had this discussion. And I said, "Mommy, that wasn't a discussion." And she said, "Well, some things were said, but we discussed things." And so that's how it happened. But I never knew, and I just never wanted to ask her. But she is a tenacious, amazing, brave woman, and it didn't surprise me that she would go through such lengths to bring me home. But then the interesting thing is that then, after that, after I left with Ulvi for good, she moved to Puerto Rico and never even told me. And then I didn't talk to my mother for 5 years. So somebody says, "Why, if you would go to such lengths to find her, why would you then not talk to her for 5 years?" And she said, "Well, I knew she was okay. I figured, I had 10 other children." And I just, there were many things going on, and I knew she was okay, and she told me that this was her decision and she was going to stick by it. So I just figured, okay, let her do it. Let her do what she needs to do. And so that was her attitude, It's just like we had to convince her that we knew what we were doing even when we didn't, and then she would kind of leave us alone. So that's the way it happened. But it was so surprising to hear that she went through all that, and then her response, because I always wondered, I thought she was angry at me. I thought she was mad at me, and that's why she wouldn't talk to me for 5 years. But she just, or she says now, I think she was angry. But now she says, "Oh no, she was okay." But I just know she was really mad at me. But anyway, so that's what happened. And according to my sisters and brothers, everything from the moment I'd left home, everything in my family changed. Everything, things that had never gone wrong before started going wrong. All the challenges that my mother had been able to overcome through sheer determination and just just brava, you know. She said, on my sisters and brothers, my mother won't say that, my sisters and brothers said everything, all of a sudden, things just didn't have the same meaning for her. And she just couldn't get through the things that she would have gotten through. And somehow, I didn't learn this until this book was published, and talking to my sisters and brothers, and my sisters in particular. My brothers don't talk very much, but my sisters, they all, especially the older ones, Delsa and Norma, the two that follow me, they said it was, after you left, it was like everything just fell apart, and the whole family was affected by that. And they told some funny stories about my belongings being scattered. My brothers taking, I was an Indian classical dancer, so I had all this jewelry that I would wear to dance, you know, and things. And so my brothers, who were teenagers, gave them to their girlfriends as, you know, Valentine's Day presents. And my sisters talk about like being in the neighborhood and seeing a girl with like, I used to have this whole collection of glass bracelets that one of my Indian dance teachers had given me, and they were beautiful, very, very delicate glass bracelets. And of course, I didn't take very much with me, but my sister says. And so we went to one of Raymond's. He was a violinist in the school orchestra or something. And we went to a performance of his violin, and so then he introduced us to this girl, and she's wearing your bracelets. And it was his girlfriend, and she says, "Isn't it pretty what Raymond gave me?" And she says, "I just wanted to take them off her wrist." So it was, you know, they're not sentimental people by any means. So that's the way it goes with them. But it's been so interesting to me to hear the response from them about, you know, because they were very, very eager, my sisters and brothers, to read this book, because like Delsa says, we weren't there for that part of your life, and so they didn't know, because I had never talked about it and they had never asked, and they were very, very eager, and I was so eager to hear from them, from that other aspect that I wasn't there for, because I really, when I did come back to the family 5 or 6 years later, everything was different. My elder sisters were married. My brother had joined the Marines and had been dishonorably discharged and put in stockades. We never knew why. You know, I mean, all kinds of terrible things happened, and I never really knew that, or never wanted to recognize. Actually, not that I didn't know, but never wanted to recognize that my leaving the family and kind of breaking up this little village that we had built in the tenements of Brooklyn, by my leaving, I broke up the village, and I just never wanted to acknowledge that. And when my sister started telling me, well, yeah, that's what happened, I had to, you know, go back and revisit and realize, well, of course, something like that would have changed the course of the entire family. My mother had put so many hopes on me, and there was so many expectations that something like that, of course, would change everything. But only a few months ago did I dare say it aloud and admit it to myself. But in the process of writing the book, I really had to think about that and ask myself and take responsibility, really, for a lot of my actions, which I think we all do. I'm not saying I am in any way different from any of you. I think that at some point in our life, we are forced to kind of take stock anyway, regardless, you know, whether it's through, you know, we have children, or we're divorced, or we're about to get married, or we're ill, or we just meditate. However it comes, we do start thinking about our lives and taking stock and hopefully taking responsibility for some of our actions. And I just never thought I would do it so publicly, you know, because I just didn't. But that's the way it is when you're a memoir writer. It's just out there for the world to see. Are there any questions? I really love it when we have a discussion. And yes. I'm 28 when it ends. It's taken me 3 books to get through 28 years. And yeah, I never thought my life was that interesting. But it turns out that, in retrospect, it seems to be more interesting than I thought. So.
Have you ever
Well, yes, Ulvi, about 7 months after we last saw one another, he called me. And I don't know how he tracked me down. I think it must have been through the college alumni office or something like that. And called me. And at the time, I was very happily living with the man who I'm still married to. And so he wanted us to get together again. And I said, no, sorry, no, thank you. So he wrote me a very nice letter and sent me $1,000. Because he said I was going to get married, and this was my present. He was going to give me a wedding present. And so I said, well, great. I sent him back another letter saying, well, this will repay some of the money that I gave you all the years that we were together. And it wasn't a very friendly response. And then I didn't hear from him again until about 3 or 4 years ago, when he wrote a letter to Merloid. Was that the way it was, Merloid? He wrote a letter to you. And inside the letter, this Merloid Lawrence, my wonderful editor, is here with us this evening. And then inside the letter was a letter to me. And we were all really worried about what this letter could contain, what it would say. But it was him saying that he had read Almost a Woman, where I first mentioned him, and that he really liked the book, and that he always knew that I had some writing talent, and would he like me to make a film out of this book? And so I wrote back to him and said, thank you, but no, I don't think so. And I haven't heard from him. And I said, it's nice to hear from him. Actually, this one was a nice letter. And I said it was nice to hear from him. And he hasn't written. So I don't know if he's still, I assume he's still alive. His dad was very old, but then I was really young, so old was not quite as old as it is right now. But he said that he comes from a line of 30 people, and they live a long time. So he's only 75. If he's only a year. My mother is 74, and she's doing okay. So I imagine that he's somewhere. But I keep expecting to see him. That I'll walk into a bookstore somewhere and he'll be there, because but I don't know.
It's interesting that he's still looking for him.
Yeah, well, he was a seeker. I mean, this is a man who tried so many different ways of being, and none of them worked out, And in many ways, actually, earlier today, I was interviewed for a cable news show, and this interviewer, whose name I have unfortunately forgotten, asked me if I saw if my mother and Ulvi shared anything, if I could, and I think that what they did share, and what they do share, is this incredible optimism that I find suspect. I'm not that much, but they're both people who are continuously reinventing their lives and trying new things and going here and taking big chances and things like that. That I, from my experience, was that most of the time these things didn't work out for them, especially the real kind of big, the more enthusiastic they would get about something, the less likely it was that it would work out. And so I always, that's the one thing I think that they both had in common. And I suppose that it's like my pessimism needs to be tempered by somebody like that, because the man I'm married to is the biggest optimist in the universe. So I think my agent says he keeps me soft. Yes.
Did any of your siblings have traumatic experiences like yours with your mother?
Oh yes, yes, I'm sure they did. I think especially the girls. In Latin cultures, boys and girls are raised with very different expectations and different sets of rules, which are supposed to eventually mesh. But they have all had big challenges with her, and one of the things that I'm doing right now is interviewing my siblings, because people always ask me about them. What are they doing now? Things like this, and so I'm interviewing them just to get their version of their lives, because I can't write their lives. I can only, they appear in my books only in relation to me. and I keep it that way because I don't think it's fair for me to in any way judge or make up or bring their lives unless it's something really specific in my life where they figure. But as I interview and talk to them, I'm learning a lot about their relationship to her, and she. I think it's, when you have that many children, you probably, and I think in order to keep them all together in your mind, I imagine, she had like she had assigned each of us a task in life. She really, I was the intelligent one, and Delsa was the scientific one, and Norma was the homemaker one, and so we all had like these little labels that she just envisioned us that way, and it's turned out that we have all kind of followed. If you go to Norma's house, and her house is the one that's very beautifully maintained. She's a great cook. She's been married to the same guy. She's the only one I think I once counted that between 6 sisters, there's something like I'm afraid to say it. I think there's like 17 husbands, I mean, just 6 sisters, and so she's she's been married to the same guy for the longest time. And then Delsa, the scientific one, is an X-ray technician, and whenever any of us get sick, she's the one with the medical knowledge, and so everybody had their own little thing, and so I think that is bound to have caused some frictions when they decided they didn't want to be that way, even though some of them eventually ended up doing the thing that she told us we were going to do. Yes. I just remembered I'm supposed to repeat the questions. The question is whether when I look back, whether there was something about me in my 20s that I wish had been different about me then, positive and not so positive. Well, I wish that I had been less innocent. I wish I had had more. I wish my mother had not protected me quite so much, because I think by protecting me as much as she did, I didn't know how to deal with the situation that I was in except to get through it. And it took me a long time to get through it. And so I wish that I had had a little bit more experience with men, with relationships, with, with saying no. I mean, I didn't know. I thought, even though my mother, well, she was, my father, she was with for 14 years before she finally realized this ain't working, And then with the next husband died, and the third one, I think he survived about 4 years. So she had learned something by the third one, So I had to go through the same process of learning, and so I just wish that I had been more, less innocent, that I'd had more experience, a little bit more worldly. And in the positive side, I think that worked for me. I think the same thing that is a disadvantage, that I see as a disadvantage, was an advantage in the sense that by picking this man, I have a hair that's driving me nuts. I think I could have picked a lot of other unsuitable men in my life, and I came very close to, in fact, picking some very unsuitable men. But I picked him, and in many ways, he was the right, I think in every way, he was the right person for me at that stage in my life, because I needed a lot of things that only he could provide from all the people that I had met up till then, that I knew then. And that was, he provided a thing that I needed desperately and wanted more than anything, and that was silence. And the bad side of that is that he's secretive, he doesn't talk, he doesn't communicate. But the good part of that was that for the first time in my life, I could walk into a place that I lived, and there was silence, and I could hear myself think, and I could really just hear myself. And that was so important to me then, and he provided that. but everything has a positive and a negative. The negative part of it was that we didn't communicate with each other. I was talking to myself, and that was a wonderful gift that I'm grateful to him for, really, because I think if I had gone off with the airplane, the larcenous pilot, if I had gone off with the guy who stole airplanes, or if I had become the mistress of the Texas politician, that would have been a very different life. And I don't think I would have had silence in those lives, and I needed silence at that time. So I think that those were the big ones. That was the big one for me. Yeah.
You're a mother now. Do you ever see your mother in this relationship with children? What, now that you are, what are some of the things that your mother was trying to accomplish with you? Have you tried in similar ways? Or?
Right. The question is about my mother and the relationship we have now, and whether I have assimilated some of. My mother was right on every point. Oh, I got the hair. My mother was right in everything she said. I have, you have to be in your 50s to realize this and be a mother yourself. But, her wisdom was hard earned and hard won, and she was right about what this man was taking from me, which was, I think the one thing she did not want me to give up was that innocence. But what she didn't realize is that is the one thing I really needed to lose. I really needed to lose it in order to do what I needed to do. My relationship with her is very good. We're really good friends. She loves coming to my house and taking care of my husband, because she claims that I don't do it quite as well as she would like me to, because I don't cook and I don't do things like clean houses and stuff like that. And my children adore her. We see her frequently. She is, in fact, I'm going on book tour, part of my tour. I'm going to Atlantic City this weekend, and she's going to be there. So she comes to the fun places. And we have a wonderful, but we don't talk about this. This is a very interesting aspect of that. And this is the way it is with my family. We're very close. We think we're very close, but like these conversations that people have on television, like the Gilmore Girls and those places, we don't have those conversations. Never have had those conversations. My sisters had to read this book to know what happened to me when I left home, because otherwise they would have never known. What inspired me to start writing memoirs was Merloid Lawrence suggested that I do it. I actually had been writing personal essays that were autobiographical in nature, and they were published, in the newspapers and some magazines, and in the alumni magazine is where Merloid saw something that I wrote that was strictly autobiographical about my mother working in a bra factory, and so she had me come in with other work that I had, because she wrote to me and she said, I'd like your work, and so I brought the stuff that I had, and I remember when she suggested that I write a memoir, I was like, is that like an autobiography? I mean, I didn't really even know what it was. I didn't know what I was doing was writing memoir. But, this is the story of my life. It's like people recognize things in me that I don't see myself. You need that. You need people like that in your life to do that for you. And that has really been an amazing thing for me, that when Merloid said, I think you're a natural memoir writer, she saw something that was years in my future, because I didn't know that that's what I could do. And so I began to write it, and when I began to write, when I was Puerto Rican, I remember that I only began with like 2 memories. I only remembered coming into this house and burning my fingers, and then the second thing I remembered is when I was about 9, this baby died, and my mother convinced me that if I didn't close its eyes, it would go to hell. So at 9 years old, I touched a dead body, and so I had these very 2 tactile experiences. See, I still do that when I think about it. It's like, ew. So I thought, wow, this is going to be the shortest memoir in history, because I only have 2 memories. But the minute I started writing, and I started writing with the first thing I remembered, then I started remembering, and remembering more and more and more in excruciating detail, to the point where it was painful for me to write, and it is painful for me to write, this work. It's painful because, what you see in the book is not everything I've written. And in order for me to give you a book, I just have to just pour it all out there and then start making selections based on objective, criteria. But it is a process of reliving. And this is where my training at Performing Arts has come in so handy for me as a memoir writer, because one of the things that I was trained to do as a teenager was to observe my life and remember things, because we were being trained to be actors, and if you remember things, then when you get to play, somebody who has to close somebody's eyes, then you go to that moment. So I was very, very much trained to do that, and I didn't realize that I was doing that until I started writing, and I realized, wow, I've retained a lot, and it just, on the best days, it's just, I can't keep up with it. It's come so fast, and such, it's like seeing a movie, and then I have to start going back and taking things out that I don't want you to know. I was under the impression that he would eventually marry me, because we talked about that, but then when it came actually time to leave with him, he said he couldn't marry me. And he kept saying, I cannot marry you. And I would say, but why? And he would say, I just can't. And he would never tell me why. And I would say, well, are you married? And he says, I cannot tell you. It is not the right time. Please trust me, Chiquita. We are doing the right thing. And so I would trust him, and it always came, whenever we'd get into these discussions, it always came to the issue of trust. It always came to him asking me to trust him with what he was telling me. And he said, if you don't trust me, then you can't be with me. And so this was the basis of the relationship, right? And so I even though I had all these doubts and all these suspicions, and I just felt like this is what a relationship is. You have to trust your partner. Of course, he didn't trust me, but it took me a long time to figure out that he was not doing what he was asking me to do. So I did assume that eventually we would get married, but by the time he got around to thinking about maybe we should get married, it was only for his convenience. It wasn't because he loved me. It wasn't because he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me. It was because if he married me, he could get his green card. And that was so offensive to me that by then I just okay, goodbye. I couldn't even think about doing it. So that's, and I have since, I think he was married, but didn't want to tell me. I don't know. I just never really learned things about him that I probably should have known, and that in a healthy relationship you would know about your lover. But he just didn't share any of these things. Yes.
Maybe I should ask you, what's the book selling? Is it selling in a particular area, or do you figure that out?
I think it's selling well because I sign a lot of books when I'm at bookstores, but I don't get that information, nor do I ask for it, because it's not helpful to me to know, if I hear that the book is selling poorly, then I'm just not going to want to leave the house to go read at the Athenaeum in Boston, So I don't know. I assume it's doing well enough that they haven't yanked me off the road since September 1st. Yes. This photograph was taken by my husband shortly after we met, and he has this picture. He has had this picture on his desk all the time that we've known each other. And when Merloyd asked me if we had any pictures because this has been the big dilemma in my memoirs. Memoirs, as you probably have noticed, most of them have pictures in the middle. Well, we were poor. We didn't have pictures, and so there are not that many pictures of me. But this is a picture that he took and that he has treasured, and so he's thrilled that it's being used and that people admire it. And I kind of look pretty cool there, too. I was 28. I know, I look like I'm 15. But I was carded until I was 30. And then I had kids, and like it all went away. I started looking like a matron. It just changed the minute I had children. I saw another hand up around here, and then oh, there you are.
Do you lose anything in writing memoirs, or do you think in that you really don't have that much privacy? I guess you didn't say you select out, but you're divulging so much of your life. Do you ever feel that you wish going back into the days too much?
The question is whether you lose anything when you write memoir, and whether there are things that I wish I could take back. There are some things that I wish I had not written, but not too many, really. I think because it is a selection, what you're reading is what I have chosen to let you read. There's a lot of my life that is not told here. In fact, my family has never questioned, argued, or denied any of the events in any of my books, but they're constantly asking me, why didn't you write about this, that, or the other? And I would say, well, I wrote it, but I decided not to include it. There's a lot of that. And I feel I have lost a little bit of privacy, but that would happen to any writer who's out on the road promoting a book. It doesn't have to be a memoir. If you're out there, your time is not yours anymore. I think for me, I have gained more than I have lost from writing memoir, because what I have gained is an understanding of how my life has an effect on others, and I get this every day when I check my email, and I get 10, 15 emails from men and women around the country who've read my work, and it means something to them, and it says something to them, and they feel like they identify with this experience, even though very frequently they'll start with, I am not Puerto Rican but, or I am not a woman but, or, I grew up in Michigan but. And so they find a place in which I and they come together in a very, very intimate way. I mean, this is what I love about books. It's you, the writer, and somebody's eyes on your work. And now if you're hearing, or audiobooks. But it's a very, very intimate relationship. And for me, when someone reads something I've written and is compelled to search me out on the internet and get to my website and write me a note and tell me that something I have written and in my life has meant something to them, that is just such an amazing gift. I can't imagine anything better than knowing that all my stupid mistakes maybe have helped other people avoid making some equally dumb things. But also, just this sense of belonging to a human race, belonging to a group of people who are struggling, who are learning, who are going through lives that may be so different from mine, but yet we have something to say to each other. And that's just, for that I thank Merloyd, because it was her idea that I do this work. So I know I'm embarrassing you, sorry. I won't mention it again. Yes.
I have two siblings, and we never agree on what happened in our lives. I find it very hard to believe that 10 siblings with no disagreement with anything.
They haven't. I wish they were here. They get asked this question all the time. I bring them whenever I can because people want to know, and they say that's the way it was. She wrote, that's the reality. They're not offended by the fact that I talk about us being on welfare, about my grandmother being an alcoholic, about my mother living with 3 men without ever marrying any of them and having 11 children with them. They say that is the reality of our lives, and she's telling the truth. And they will in fact say, why should we argue with that? She's telling the truth. And, I'm not going to argue with them. Well, I think in the small details, they are not concerned with the small details. I mean, I think if, for instance, when you read in Almost a Woman that on that cold winter day, I came up the stairs of our apartment and my grandmother was making an asopao, she might have been frying pork chops for all that I remember. It doesn't matter. That detail doesn't matter. What matters is on that cold day, there's the warmth of the family behind that door, and it smells like love, and this is the way we relate to one another. And I think in many ways, my siblings have understood that more than my readers, that I have had to take liberties with that. I have had to give details that are, I remember, this is the way I remember it, probably, a good example is, I think it's in when I was Puerto Rican, I mentioned go-go boots, my white go-go boots. And Elsa says, well, those were not your white go-go boots. But there were go-go boots, and that's what matters to them. And my brother Raymond actually just the other day told me, in the Masterpiece Theater film, there's a scene in which Raymond, as a 4-year-old, has his foot. We're taking him to the doctor, and the foot is bloody, and he's bandaged, and the doctor has to change the bandage. And I remember the day we were shooting that scene, the director asked me, which foot was it? Was it the right or the left? And I'm like, I don't remember. I don't remember which foot it was. Well, I tried to call Raymond, but Raymond was in Korea. He's an army guy. He was in Korea, and his wife didn't know, So I just took a guess, and we all looked at a bicycle from that time period, and we tried to reconstruct how somebody would have put their foot into the spokes, and then, which foot it might have been. So I said left. Well, on Monday, the film was made in the year 2000, screened in 2002. Monday, there was a screening in Atlanta, and he lives near Atlanta, and he came to it. And at the end of it, the producer asked him, well, what do you think about it? And he says, well, I'm a technical man. I mean, everything about the film is great, but he says, it was the right foot. See, but what matters is that it was a foot. It wasn't an arm. It wasn't an ear, And so they don't quibble with that, because that's not what's important to them. I think what's important is the essence of the experience and the moment that I'm trying to describe there. Yes.
Every summer, my family has a reunion, and one of the greatest gifts that comes out of it is stories from my mother's generation and my grandmother's generation. How do your children respond to your writings? Do you share with them beyond what you share with us as your family?
My family is my children. I remember when I was Puerto Rican came out, and my daughter was 90. She was about 7, and my son was around 12. And so he was 11, and he didn't want to read it. He says, I don't want to know. So I said, okay, that is your choice. You don't have to read, And so he didn't read it until he was a senior in high school. And he says, Mom, they're making me read your book. They're making everybody read your book. So I said, well, fine, okay, but if you really object to reading it, I'll talk to the teacher and tell him that you're uncomfortable. And he said, no, I'll read it, And so then he read it and told me, oh, you're a really good writer, Mom. So it was very complimentary. My daughter read it and really loved it, but neither one of them gave me a lot of feedback. Before this book was published, my children are now, my daughter is 20, my son is 24, and they both arranged to be out of the country when this book came out. Because my daughter, I remember when she saw the title, The Turkish Lover, she says, that's not about my father. Well, no, it isn't. Is it a guy before my father? So, according to our children, of course, you only have had sex twice, So I said, well, no, it's not about your father, but it's about a very important relationship in my life. She says, don't say anymore. I don't want to know. And so she left. The book was officially, I started my tour September 1st. She left the country on August 27th and has not been back and will not be back. Just doesn't want to know, doesn't want to hear about it, just doesn't. And my son's the same way. These are, it's too close for them. They just don't want to know. And they saw the movie and they like the movie, but seeing the film is like, again, it goes to that intimacy of a book. Seeing the film, you're seeing actors, they look nothing like the real people, and so they could see it as a movie. But they are really just, it's too close for them. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to share
Right. Well, I think we have all had a bad relationship, except maybe for the very young woman here. We have all had a bad one, I mean, I don't know that anyone has been immune from that. We've all had somebody in our lives. It just didn't work out. They're not bad people. We're not bad people. It just didn't work out. So we all have that. And I think few of us get the chance to look back on those relationships and look at it closely, really microscopically, and not only look at the relationship, but look at us in relation to the relationship and in relation to the other person, and try to, like the hardest thing for me to do in this book really was to realize that I was so complicit in this. I was a smart 21-year-old streetwise Puerto Rican kid from Brooklyn, and I'm like, how did I ever get enmeshed in this relationship? How did that happen? So all of a sudden, as I'm writing it, I realized, well, I let it happen. I allowed it to happen. I invited it into my life. There were so many opportunities I had to put an end to this particular relationship. I had friends who told me, Esmeralda, this is just really not good for you. And I just didn't listen. I just couldn't see it. I didn't see it in the way that they saw it. And I didn't see it until I started writing, and then I realized, I have to be truthful in my own, how I was in this relationship. It just wasn't about this being a bad man. He wasn't a bad man. He was just not the best man for me. And maybe, maybe there's somebody else in his life who has had better luck, but it just wasn't right for us. And it's a hard thing to take responsibility for those kinds of things, for your own complicity in relationships that are destructive, which this one could have been way, way more destructive than it was. I was very fortunate that I was able to, I had a lot of support. I had friends who, even though they let me be in it, they were there, and they kept pointing things out until they kept, it's like I now think of it as they kept hitting me over the head until I finally realized what they were trying to tell me. But some people don't have that, but I did, and so I had to really say to myself, you can't blame him for this relationship. It wasn't his fault. It was both of us. It was our circumstances. This was a man from a foreign country, learning English, trying to get along in American society, having dreams and aspirations. A man who was in the early, he was 36, 7. So it's not middle age, but he's entering that sort of that cusp in which men start measuring themselves against what they have accomplished. I didn't know that as a 20-year-old, that he was himself in some sort of crisis. I couldn't even have thought about that. It didn't, I don't think that I would have cared if I had, really, because I was a 20-year-old and, he was old, So, but it wasn't until looking back that I realized, this poor man, he was suffering too. And it wasn't until the very end of our relationship that I realized that he had been in crisis and that I wasn't helping. And but that we couldn't be in crisis together. That just wasn't going to work. I wasn't going to get him through his crisis. He just was going to have to find somebody else to do that because I had already done enough. So it takes a long time, and it was hard. I cried a lot writing this book. I would write an hour, cry an hour, write an hour, cry 2 hours. It was tough.
I was going to ask you that about the catharsis. Was it that, did you feel better when you had gotten it out there?
Did I feel better once? Well, I think I felt better once I wrote a book that I was happy with. I can't feel better about having been complicit in my own. I gave myself over to somebody who didn't deserve it. The person I'm married to, I've given him my life, and he's given me his. That's a good deal. But when you give your life to somebody and you don't get their lives back, that is not a good deal. Young people take notice. And so I felt bad for the young woman that I was. I felt sorry for her. I felt sorry for myself, but I didn't want to write a book full of self-pity, because that would have been really even more embarrassing for me. It would have been terrible. And I have to say that I think what it did is it allowed me to see him in a way that I couldn't have seen him. I couldn't see him then, you know. My husband thinks I was too nice to him. A lot of people think I was too nice to him. But I don't feel, you know, I feel like he was not a bad person, I don't think. I mean, I don't know. You know, maybe he killed somebody and I don't know it, but I mean, you know, I really, especially towards the end of our relationship, he really was struggling with what was happening in the relationship. And I think he was struggling because he had to struggle, because I was no longer just this docile little thing letting him manage everything. So I don't know. I don't know if I feel better. Yeah. If there are no more questions, I think one more question. Yes.
It's a double question. When you go to Puerto Rico, do you go to Macun every time? Have you avoided?
I have avoided going to Macun since the last time I was there in 1976. And the reason I have avoided doing that is because it was so disappointing. It was so different that the memory I had of this place, it has now become my image of it. And I didn't want to go there and not see what I saw in my imagination anymore. You know, the place where I grew up was torn down to make way for a road to Dorado, in fact. And I have the key to the city if you need to get in. And but I haven't been, and I don't want to go. My uncle still lives there. Many readers have made their way to Puerto Rico, have found my uncle's house, and he has given tours of the barrio. And, you know, this is the pomarosa tree that she used to climb. And then in September, while I was at one of the bookstores, this was such a funny thing. I'm sitting there and I'm reading and I'm talking to people the way I'm talking to you, and there's this whole little group like in the back, and they're all just having a great time, way beyond the jokes that I'm telling. You know, I said, they're all having a great time, and they all look familiar. Like, who are these people? It was a whole contingent from Macun of the people who still live there, who are mentioned in When I Was Puerto Rican, Doña Cena's daughters, and Doña Paula, and Don Lalao, and all these people who still live there and remember me, and they came and they brought me, you know, vegetables and plant things. But I'd rather see it in my imagination. Those people are still there. Yeah. Except they look different too. I didn't, you know, my playmates, Doña Cena's daughters, are like old women, and then I realized, oh, they're my age. So it's, you know, and actually this is just one last comment. I know we have to, but I go to schools frequently to talk, because When I Was Puerto Rican is read at a lot of schools, and I was recently at a school, and the kids were really disappointed to see me, because they see me as this like 7-year-old girl climbing the hills of Macun. And I go, well, you know, people, I am the person who wrote this, really. And they say, well, you don't look like Maggie. But it really is me. You know, and I think they were experiencing the same thing that I experienced, of just that I think somehow the imagination is a lot better. So. Well, thank you so much for being so attentive and so warm, and I'd be happy to sign your book. Thank you very much.